Norman, thank you for having us here today. Your wood sculptures are stunning. So when did you start working with wood?
Oh, I started when I was a teenager, and my dad had a business. He was a wood pattern maker, had his own business, and frequently I would, go there and sweep the floor, and he'd get me started in woodworking when I was a kid, and so it's been a long time.
But you didn't feel like that was an artistic outlet? That didn't feel like artistry to you?
Not until when I was in college. I took a music history course, and it kind of got me interested in art. And after that, it was this thing on my mind. Maybe someday I'd like to do that. Maybe someday I could. But as far as the artistic side of it, that has been definitely a learning curve. I felt somewhat, unqualified. I have no formal training in visual art, and I was just quite a bit inhibited. I'm not an artist. I'm not a formal artist. I never went to school and all this, and I was somewhat hesitant to try to express myself in the sculptures I made. I said, well, this is going to be weird. People aren't going to like it or something. But over a period of time, over a few years, I've been gaining more confidence in what I'm doing. And so that's been a definite learning curve for me.
Let's talk a little bit about your sculptures. They are so beautiful. It's hard for me to believe that you haven't been doing this since infancy. How do you come up with a design, first of all? What sort of inspires that? And then how do you go about deciding how to execute it?
Well, there are a number of ways that I come up with a design. Sometimes it's just a sketch on paper, something comes very quickly sometimes over the course of, or sometimes it takes a while, over a few days or even weeks. Sometimes I play with a sketch. Sometimes I just pick up a piece of wood and try to decide what I'm going to do with it. I put some lines on it. I look at the grain, I look at any imperfections in the wood, and I come up with something in that way. And there's other ways too. Sometimes I'll start a sculpture and I'll just set it aside because something isn't right. What my original plan isn't going to work, and I'll just set it aside and come back to it later. Sometimes I have pieces of sculpture that I set aside that I didn't use, and I will bring them together and make something that works. There's quite a few ways that I come up with my ideas.
So how much of your process is creative thinking in terms of how can I make this happen?
Well, the artistic side of it takes up more of my attention when I'm working or not working. I'm thinking about it all the day long. And the woodworking aspect of it does take a significant amount of time, but it's not as much time as the artwork itself. Coming up with design, I'm very extremely conscious and motivated to come up with something that is original and that is artistically good, I guess.
So how do you describe your work? What is artistically good to Norman?
Usually it takes a while. I'll make something and immediately I might like it, but over a course of time, my judgment changes a little bit and say, well, I can do better than that. So it's just a matter of getting the idea, thinking about it for a while, saying, is this going to work or isn't going to work, and then making the sculpture. And sometimes after that, thinking, was that the best idea? Was that the best way to go about it? Is that express what you wanted to make? And so it's quite a long process. It involves time before and after I complete the sculpture, I guess.
When you start to have those second-guessing thoughts, if you're working on a piece that you just don't feel is working, do you abandon the whole piece, or do you just go back to the drawing board and try to rework it? Or
I just set it aside. I don't abandon it. I just set it aside with the intention that, well, I'll pick this up eventually sometime in the future. I mean, there's a unfinished sculpture in my bedroom sitting on the shelf that's been there for 3 years. When I'm sitting on or laying on my bed or sitting on my bed, I look at it and try to come up with ideas on what to do with it. And it's been there for 3 years, so someday I'll eventually complete it.
Do you have a favorite type or species of wood to make your pieces?
First, when I was making smaller things, I favored the more hardwood, the more dense wood, because it's just, I don't know, it has a feel to it that seems to me increase its worth. But over time, I've been making larger sculptures, and I've been finding out that the harder the wood is, the more work it is to sculpt it and complete the form that I want to make. So I've been leaning more towards softer woods, like softer mahogany or softer maple, and
I want to talk through your process a little bit. I know that we've hit some different points of it. So you have your kind of design phase, where you're sketching and that, or perhaps just putting lines on an actual piece of wood. What happens from there? Is it just, a series of different tools? What happens after the initial idea is greenlit?
Well, I always try to take generally I'm starting with a block of wood, a big piece of wood, and I try to I make it as parallel and square as possible. You know what it's not a rough cut piece of wood. One thing I try to emphasize in my work is the precision of it, and to do that, to accomplish that, I need to start with a block of wood that is perfectly flat and parallel on both sides and square on the edges, because from there I establish the design or the lines. Many times I'm using a symmetrical design, and it's important that everything is dimensionally mirrored on both sides of the piece. And so I have to start with a very precisely formed piece of wood in terms of a rectangular, square, whatever. And from there, I start putting shape in it in one direction, then I put shape in it in another direction, then I put shape in it in the third direction, and from there I work out all the remaining surfaces that need to be finalized and completed to finish the work.
When you are sketching the piece, are you thinking of it in terms of that initial block of wood and then what has to be taken away and sort of the negatives? And my brain just doesn't work that way, so it's fascinating to think of conceptualizing it and then making it happen on a block of wood.
Well, with a block of wood, when I start with the wood and say I'm going to do something with this piece of wood, that I do start thinking about immediately, how am I going to cut this? How am I going to shape this form? How am I going to put this surface in there? How am I going to do that? But when I'm sketching on paper, it's a little bit different. I'm trying to come up with something artistic, and the woodworking aspect of it is back in my mind. I'm not thinking about it, and usually the problems come forward when I get in the shop and say, okay, how am I going to do this now? And I have to work out all the details, and that's sometimes a bit of a challenge.
Then how do you finish off a piece? Do you stain it? Do you seal it? How does that work?
Generally, I don't use stain. I like the look and feel of the naturally finished wood, and I use a polyurethane finish now. I'm kind of going to start experimenting with different finishes, but it's the one thing I do though is I sand the surface. I get most of the surface. Sometimes I have a rough surface for contrast, but most of the surfaces on my sculpture are sanded to like a really fine grit sandpaper to make it extremely smooth. I start out with a rough grit sandpaper and work down to there to where it's feels almost like glass sometimes.
Knowing how much thought and care and time goes into all of your pieces, does it matter to you how they are received? Do you have an expectation as to what you want people to feel or take away when they see your work?
Yes, definitely. It matters a lot to me. I think it would matter a lot to any artist. What I want people to take away from it is, I think of it in terms of myself as a musician. Very often, music is something that heals and brings inner peace and serenity to ourselves when we're troubled or something like that. And I think visual art should do the same thing to some extent. Art should uplift and kind of draw someone out of all the troubles of the world and bring them into the better side of humanity and what we can produce. And I try to replicate the therapeutic effect that music often has. I try to replicate that in the art I make so that people can look at my art and somehow be, I don't know, uplifted in some sense.
I love that answer. That's perfect. What has art taught you about yourself?
The value of hard work and perseverance and having a goal is something that is indispensable. The idea of not giving up and, you know, we're all here on this earth for a purpose, and that you can find your purpose in life and fulfill it somehow. I think that's something that's important to me.
Your work is exquisite. I see some things in person here, and just looking at the photos, everything looks perfect. And certainly looking at your pieces brings me calm and peace and serenity. So thank you so much. Please continue to create, and thank you for taking the time today.
Well, thanks so much for having me here.
Arts in Focus on PBS Fort Wayne is funded in part by